Next, we're going to apply subtracting integers to the idea of absolute value. And so let's look at this first example together. So here we have 2 times the absolute value of 6 minus 8 minus negative 4 times 3 minus negative 2 plus 6. So the first thing I'm going to insist that you do is go through and change all subtraction to addition. Just rewrite this problem changing all subtraction to addition. So we changed minus 8 to add the opposite. Minus a negative 4 becomes plus 4. 3 minus negative 2 becomes plus 2, and then plus 6. Now we're going to work inside the absolute value bars and treat them like parentheses. So 6 plus negative 8, what does that give you? Negative 2, correct. Then we have plus 4 times, so 3 plus 2 is what? 5 plus 6 is what? 11. So we have 4 times the absolute value of 11. Now the next step you need to show me is taking the absolute value of everything, so don't skip this step. So we're going to write 2 times the absolute value of negative 2 is positive 2, plus 4 times the absolute value of 11 is just 11. And then we are going to multiply before we add, because we always want to use our order of operations. 2 times 2 is 4. And what's 4 times 11? 44. Good. And then what's 4 plus 44? 48. Very good. So now I'd like you to pause the video and try this next problem. Let's see how you did. So you should have all of your steps written out. Make sure that you change all subtraction to addition. And in doing, you will find that you ran across hopefully something that is the key to this problem, and that's where you change the subtraction between the two absolute values to add the opposite. And then what you have to keep in mind as you work through this problem is that whatever you get as the absolute value of 100 plus negative 120, you're going to have to find the opposite of that. So I'm going to work through this and make sure that you understand how to do this kind of problem. Negative 12 plus negative 8 is negative 20. Plus the opposite of 100 plus negative 120 is negative 20. And then the absolute value of negative 20 is positive 20. The absolute value of negative 20 is positive 20, but then we have to put that opposite sign in front of it. So 20 plus negative 20 is 0. Moving on, we're going to talk about subtraction with decimals. And the only thing that you have to do differently here than you did with addition is that very first step of changing subtraction to addition. So what do you think the first step would end up giving you in number 1? You should end up with negative 18 and 1/10 plus 25. Now you'll want to keep in mind to line up your decimals. So I'm going to put 0.0 for my 25 to help me line up my decimals. And then you want to make sure that you use your integer rules. So you're going to ask yourself, am I adding like signs or different signs? So they're different signs. Therefore, what do? Do you add or subtract the numbers? You subtract them. And what's the sign going to be? How do you determine the sign? You're going to determine the sign because of whichever number you have more of. We have more positives, so our answer is going to be positive. So I'd like you to take this process and try numbers 1 and 2 while pausing the video, and then come back and check them. So for number 1, you should end up with 6 9/10, or 6.9. Number 2, you should end up with 15.8, or 15 8/10. Here you also had different signs, so you had to subtract, and you had more positives than negatives, at least once you got down to this point where you line up your decimals. Keep in mind with number 2 that we had to change the 0 minus 8.3 to 0 plus negative 8.3, and then this minus negative 24.1 to plus 24.1. So one thing I want to reiterate here is that when you have several numbers that you are subtracting, let's say we have -6 minus 4 minus 8, it's really important that you keep in mind you always keep that sign on the first number, and then every number that comes after a subtraction symbol, that's where you're going to be changing the subtraction to addition and changing that number's sign to the opposite. So -6 doesn't have a subtraction in front of it, it's just a -6. However, 4 and 8 have a subtraction in front of them, so we're going to have to change subtraction to addition and the 4 to a negative and the 8 to a negative, since that's the opposite sign of each of those. Now we're going to evaluate algebraic expressions. So here what you're going to do is substitute the number in the place of the variable and then find your final answer. So I'll do number 1 with you. Let's try this together. Your first step is always your substitution step, and that's where you take your number and put it in the place of your variable. So I'm going to replace y with -5.1, and I'm going to replace x with -3.2. So -5.1 minus -3.2, and I'm going to put that -3.2 in parentheses to distinguish subtraction from a minus sign, since those are two different ideas there. Subtraction is an operation and a negative means opposite. So even though they look like the same symbol, they're actually different. They have different meanings. So we end up with -5.1 plus 3.2 when we set that up. Now go ahead and finish this and see what you get. Pause the video. You should end up with -1.9. Let's move on to the next problem. And you go ahead and try this one, but just be very careful as you're substituting negative numbers and you have opposite signs in front of them. So that's an opposite sign there in front of your y. So you're going to want to substitute everything straight in. And I'll start you off with the substitution here. So it's the opposite of y, which is -5.1. minus x, which is -3.2. Now I have to come down and change all subtraction to addition. And whenever I have opposite a negative, what does that give you? Right, a positive. So the opposite of a negative is a positive. And then we're going to change subtraction to addition and make that -3.2 a positive 3.2. So this is actually a pretty easy problem. You could do this in your head. What do you think 5.1 plus 3.2 equals? 8.3 is correct. So let's move on to the next problem. I'm going to have you pause the video and figure this problem out yourself. So here are the steps. This one's pretty tricky. We have to find the opposite of x. So I substitute in the opposite of -3.2, which gives me positive 3.2. Now if you want to just jump right down to this step because it's confusing to write down all these symbols right here, that's fine. It's up to you. Depends on what helps you think. So the opposite of -3.2 is positive 3.2. Then we have our minus, and then we're looking for the opposite of y. Well, the opposite of y is going to be 5.1. So I wrote down the opposite of -5.1, which is positive 5.1. And I want to be very clear what these numbers are before I change my subtraction to addition. So that's why I left my subtraction in that second step there. And now I'm going to change it to add the opposite. So if you would like, you can start on this step if that's easier. It just depends on how you learn as to which step you will start on. So you should end up with 3.2 plus -5.1. When you subtract, you end up with 1.9, and we have more negatives than positives.